We're used to it. So anyway, so happy to welcome Meg for our lecture series this year. She is the author of many books, two of which are on your tables today. She will be doing book signing this after the lecture in the surf room. She's written a book called Life in the Treetops. She lived in Australia, got her PhD, and has also been the director of the Selby Gardens. And presently, she is executive director of the Tree Foundation, which is known locally to be, throughout internationally, building canopy walks through the trees. And if you go to Mayaca State Park, you will see one of the first ones that was built with Meg's oversight. So now she's sponsoring a new initiative called Mission Green to stop global deforestation. So we want to be planting trees, and so we're really excited to have her here today and among our small tree canopy. And so we welcome Meg Melman. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, my dear.
Thank you.
I've been vaccinated, so I get to hug her. Such a joy to be here, and yes, it is one of the best canopies in the world. For all of you who are local, raise your hand if you live in Florida. Oh, see, lots of people who get to enjoy beautiful canopies. Well, while I have your attention for a quiz, raise your hand if you ever climbed a tree in your life. Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Well, good for you all. Anyway, I think we all started that way, didn't we? As kids, you know, you love that idea, and maybe there's an ancestor somewhere millions of years ago that lived in the trees, whatever you believe in terms of evolution. But it is neat that there's some kind of link, I think, between kids and trees. So I do a lot of school talks now, like maybe 3 or 4 a week on Zoom all around the country to kids, and they all just seem to love trees. But we have a lot of homework because they are disappearing, and in my lifetime, and maybe I'm older than most of you, I don't know, but half of the world's trees have disappeared, 50%, and that's not a good track record that all of us are sharing. So we really need to get on the ball, because as you all know, trees do so much for us, and if you don't remember all those wonderful things, I'll review it later. We have a new college person here, one of my old colleagues, and he knows everything about everything because he went to a college where I was fortunate to be a professor for a while, and that's fun too. But I did want to maybe tell a few stories through these 2 books that are on your table, and just for fun, I published this memoir last August. It's called The Arbornaut. Now be honest, raise your hand if you ever heard of that word Arbornaut. Oh, cool, we got a couple really, people on Jeopardy, right, or something. But that word is, do you know what an aquanaut is? Someone who works undersea. So that word was coined in the 1950s when we invented scuba gear. Then we have astronaut. Anybody ever heard of that word? And that was in the 1960s when NASA took the first flight to the moon. And guess what? It wasn't until the 1980s that scientists started climbing trees for research. It's that new of a science. And so a couple of us coined this word arbornaut based on trees, right? Tree nut. My sons call me arbor nut, but it is arbornaut technically. And so that is the one book. And the other is a children's book, actually not written by me, but by a person I got to know because she trailed me down to the Amazon. She's a famous children's book author named Heather Lang, and she's a wonderful author, and the illustrations are fabulous. So I thought, a lot of times my mom says to me, Meg, nobody wants to read a book that's 250 pages, but this one's only 30. So it's a nice way to summarize what arbornauts do, and she did a lovely job at this. But why is it, I'm sure you're all asking yourself, why didn't we ever climb a tree for research until 1980? And it is kind of crazy. So I'm going to just read you the first paragraph of my preface, and you'll get hopefully a little understanding about how crazy this world of ours is. Imagine going to the doctor for a complete checkup, and in the course of an entire visit, the only body part examined was your big toe. The visit ends with a pronouncement that you are perfectly healthy, but there was no test of your vital signs, heartbeat, vision, or any other part of you, just the big toe. You may have gone in with a broken arm or a headache from high blood pressure, but the assessment of your lowest bipedal extremity alone couldn't clue the doctor into the real trouble. How would you feel? At the very least, you'd probably switch doctors. For centuries, the health of trees, even those ancient giants stretching hundreds of feet high into the clouds, was assessed in just the same way, examining woody trunks at eye level. Oops, hello. Hello. Oh, back? Yes, okay, back. Oh, hold it. Ooh, thank you. Examining woody trunks at eye level, scientists essentially inspected the big toes of their patients and then made sweeping deductions about forest health without ever gazing at the bulk of the tree, known as the canopy, growing overhead. The only time foresters had the chance to evaluate a whole tree was when it was cut down, which is kind of like assessing a person's entire medical history from a few ashes after cremation. In tropical forests especially, the lower levels are as different from the upper reaches as night and day. So basically, forestry for 200 years looked at either dead trees fallen on the forest floor, or they looked at the bottom of a tree trunk and said, oh, look at this tree, looks pretty healthy. And so guess what? It wasn't until 1985 or 6 when I and a couple other folks got up there that we found millions and millions and millions of things live at the top of a tree. In fact, half of the species on the planet live in the top of a tree. Meaning, you could probably go home today, and if you climbed your local little tree in your backyard, I can almost promise you, you could find a new species. We estimate in science that less than 10% of those canopy species have been classified and observed, so that leaves plenty to go around. And it's just so crazy because in a way, it's really close to all of us, but yet it's far away because nobody ever figured out the methods, which aren't that difficult, or took the time and the effort to do it. And that's kind of why I ended up calling this book, The Arbornaut, a life discovering the 8th continent in the trees above us, because it's really a new continent. We could all be Christopher Columbus to go to the canopy because nobody's probably ever been there before. And most of you probably can say with some confidence, if you've lived in your home for over a decade, that nobody's ever climbed the trees in your own yard, because you would probably know it if they had done that. So you could have new species there. So this is kind of surprising and shocking, and that's why probably we haven't been such good stewards of our trees. And I think as we now explore the whole tree, not just the big toe, we suddenly find out they do things like store carbon. When human beings pollute carbon dioxide from cars and factories and cement and other things, the trees actually absorb and store carbon. And we've learned a lot about this by studying the top of the tree. We know exactly how trees bring in sunlight and create energy. We know how they make oxygen from all of their foliage. And we're only just starting to know how all those cool things are that live in the top. Other things trees do for us, of course, is provide timber, and that can be very sustainable, and it's incredibly important. They provide all kinds of food. My favorite food comes from a tree. Anybody know a food that comes from a tree? Mango, good one. What? Avocado. Apples. What was that? Peach, yeah. Cherry. Cashews, fantastic. Walnut. Still missing my favorite. You had some for dessert today. Chocolate. Chocolate comes from a tree. Do you know it grows off the trunk of the tree in those capsules? Amazing, isn't it, that somebody would have ever harvested those hard-looking nuts and chop it up and put sugar with it and said, delicious. But it is kind of surprising that all these things come from trees, as well as all kinds of different fabrics and building materials, ropey things and thatch for roofs and all things like that. So it is amazing. And last but not least, to think about is trees provide for about 2 billion people on Earth a very important spiritual heritage. If you've ever traveled in India or many parts of Africa, either a big fig is the sacred tree in the center of the village, or in Africa, sometimes trees surround the churchyards to make important spiritual sanctuaries. So that's a huge value that we might not put a dollar sign on it, but it keeps the people healthy and helps with human spirit, which is, of course, a very valuable thing. So in this book called The Arbornaut, I do kind of embarrassingly start out as a child and try to recall my childhood. And I'd be so happy to answer any questions later, such as, how does an editor help you write a book? And I have to give my editor a lot of credit, because she kept saying, like, why were you a geek when you were little? And what did you do that was so geeky? Because I would write these sentences, I was a geek when I was young, and then I would move on to when I was old. And she's like, no, you have to tell the stories of all the crazy things you did. You have to give your audience more kind of substance. So it was a really interesting experience to write for Farrar, Straus and Giroux, a big, one of the bigger publishers, because the editors are incredibly good, and she just pushed me. I had to sit by myself a lot to recall my childhood. I called all my old girlfriends from age 3 and 4 and 5. Fortunately, we're still best friends in my little hometown, and we all sat around and tried to think about what we did when we were kids, and boy, was that ever amazing. I guess part of the dilemma of being an author. And the other thing I used a lot for writing this book was journals. I always kept journals when I went away. So if anybody here is an aspiring author, sometimes just one word or a little flavor of a place where you went or worked or thought something can give you that recall on whatever the situation was. So that was really helpful to me, and I was so lucky that I still had my journals. So I talk a little bit at the beginning about this business of growing up. Did anybody like me grow up and play outdoors a lot? And of course that's because we're probably all over 30, most of us. But nowadays there's a lot of dilemma. They call it the nature deficit disorder, with kids seeing nature on screens and being indoors, because in many cases they either live in a city or their parents are frightened of things like spiders and maybe vines that might have little thorns or some such things. I'm not sure what parents are frightened of, but there seems to be a lot of fear of nature that kids are unfortunately getting told to stay indoors. Maybe it's fear of people too, because there's sometimes seedy things going on in the neighborhood. But it was, as I look back, for me, a major force in my life to be able to have that privilege where my mom would open the door after breakfast and just say, dinner's at 6 o'clock, and off we'd go. I mean, she knew some of the stuff we got up to. It's a miracle we didn't break all our bones, but, that was just part of the joy, I guess, of being a kid. And I was obsessed with nature. I had birds' nests under my bed, and I had snake skins and dried plants in every telephone book. Do you remember when telephone books were paper? Oh my, that really dates us, doesn't it? Because now I tell that to kids and they're like, what is that? They never heard of such a big book made out of paper. But it was a great plant press. It was wonderful. And so I would, have all these treasures, and whereas most of my girlfriends, wanted to have nail polish or curlers or, 45 records of the Beatles or some such thing. So it was kind of crazy. Oops. Come back, come back. There it is. So anyway, those were the days. But I thought it was important to maybe explain how does somebody become a scientist? Because I sure didn't meet any women scientists when I was growing up, and that always for me was a real kind of stumbling block. In fact, I never even knew I could be a scientist. Even worse, I never even knew about rainforests till I went to college, because nobody in my little rural elementary school even knew about them as well. I don't think the teachers knew about them. So today, you know, kids can get books like this Leaf Detective, or they can go online and look up, you know, the jungles of the Amazon. It is incredible, the knowledge that kids can absorb, but it was also fun to discover it ourselves. And so I went, of course, from being this geeky nature lover to then wanting to go only to a college that had a research forest. And that was my criteria for picking colleges. New College didn't rank because it didn't have a research forest, but I just had this weird kind of criteria. But guess what? It worked, and I went to the forest at Williams College almost every single day and did some research on leaves, and that kind of really sort of solidified my interest in nature. And I was hoping I could be a forest ranger. It's the only thing I knew about that maybe somebody could do outdoors when they grew up. And I had some hiccups along the way. I talk a little more honestly than I ever did in a book before. I talked about some of the professors that told me that girls couldn't be scientists and forbid me to take geology because that was for boys. And you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would have been very scared to write that on paper, because I thought, oh, I'll probably lose my job. Somebody will tell me that I'm not suitable because girls shouldn't talk like that. And now that I'm kind of in the sunset years, right, I feel a little braver to have my voice. And it's my real hope from this book that girls, as well as boys, would read it and maybe get a better sense of how to be smarter than I was, how to get from A to B without all the hurdles that I experienced. And if young women can learn that, and maybe young men can benefit from that, then I feel that I will have done my job. So, you know, I move on, and I did get a scholarship to go to Sydney University. I was very unsure that I was worthy of that. And of course, the first day I was there, the head of the department pulled me in his office and said, "Why is a girl like you doing a PhD when you'll only get married and have children?" And I was so shy, I had no answer. I just stood there with my eyes open and said, "Nice to meet you, goodbye." And anyway, but you know, it's just those kind of things that were more commonplace, I think, then, and that we just kind of assumed. And I thought to myself, well, even if I flunk out, maybe I'll get to see a koala bear in the wild, so that'll be worth it. So I just doggedly kept on doing these things. But what really is amazing, that when I saw my first rainforest, which was in Australia, and now we're on to chapter 3, they were 200 feet high, and my trees back in upstate New York were only 50 feet high. So did I get the shock of my life? I'm like, I guess I can't free climb these like I did back home. So I ended up going to the caving club at Sydney University and borrowing some ropes and making a harness out of seatbelt webbing with a borrowed sewing machine, and taking a piece of metal and welding it at the university shop into a Y shape to make a slingshot. So then I took the fish line to put over a branch, and then some nylon blind cord, which was strong enough then to hoist the climbing rope. And so that was the beginning of this world of the Arbornaut. And I was one of 2 first people to do this. The other guy was in Costa Rica, but we had no internet in 1981 or 2, so we didn't know each other till 5 years later. We met at a conference by lucky coincidence. But he did this in Costa Rica, and I did this in Australia, and lo and behold, we kind of started these 2 lineages of lots of students learning about the canopy, which was pretty neat. But when I first went up, it was so scary, and of course I didn't know if the branch was big enough or rotten, or if there would be biting ants or poisonous snakes coiled at the top, and all the kinds of things that you see on television, right, with Tarzan. But lo and behold, I got up into the canopy, and it was like this incredible it was like going to Times Square at night, and it was so busy with activity of pollinators and things eating things and things flying and things that were colorful and birds eating the bugs and lizards eating the bugs and everything happening. So the difference between the forest floor and the top of the tree was just extraordinary, and I was, of course, spellbound and addicted. And even though I have what I call a respect for heights, I'm not one of these daredevils that loves to go hang gliding every day, but I had all this curiosity about what was going on. And one of my basic questions, this is chapter 4, was all about leaves. Everything you wanted to know about leaves, but were afraid to ask. And you know, in the temperate zones, what happens to leaves in October? Yeah, they get colorful and they fall down. So that was my whole life. Leaves did that. And I got to the tropics, and guess what? They're green all year round. I couldn't believe it. No orange, no yellow, no red. And lo and behold, no empty canopies for half the year. So I thought, I'm going to design a really easy thesis. I'm going to try to measure how long a tropical leaf stays on the tree. And maybe I can hang a hammock, and I can lie there and wait for the leaves to fall on my lap, and then I can enjoy myself, and lo and behold, I'll have this really easy thesis. Well, did I ever make a boo-boo on that one? Do you know how long, maybe someone's read this book, a tropical leaf can live? Bonus question, I should have given a prize. 20 years was my record, and that's just me studying Australian rainforest trees, which was amazing, practically. But I did that because I measured new leaves, and then I monitored them every month. And because I ended up staying in Australia and getting married and having my kids, I was able to go back to these remaining leaves even after I got my PhD. And that was just amazing to think that they live longer than a lot of birds, and definitely longer than a lot of our garden flowers, for example. It was very surprising and really opened our eyes to the importance of this foliage and how different. I kind of liken it to, you know, living in the penthouse. The real estate in a tree is so different. You can live in the basement, or you can live in the middle floors, and you can live at the top, which is very subject to extraordinary, lots of heat, direct sun, lots of heavy winds, but on the other hand, all the flowers and the fruits are up there, so it's a real action spot. I call it the salad bar in the sky, because obviously all the things that eat leaves, which is a lot of things, want to go up there where the leaves are. They don't want to hang out on the forest floor where the leaves are brown and dried. So if you want the action spot in a forest, you go to the top of the tree, which was really amazing. And so I became one of the world's first arbonauts, and that I didn't know at the time, but it led me on this global quest, because now, as one of the few trained people in forest canopies, I got asked to do a lot of things. I got invited to Bogor Gardens in Indonesia to train their botanical staff to study their canopies, and I got invited to Ethiopia to come and help solve problems with their deforestation of their church forests, and I got invited to Malaysia to help them make a canopy walkway. And so this thing started to happen, and so over my little lifetime, you know, the geek from a very rural town in upstate New York has worked in 46 countries when I added it up, because kids, 5th graders, always ask me that. How many places have you been? And I never knew the answer till about a month ago, and I had to look on my old passports. I pulled them out of the closet and had to look at all the stamps to say, where in the heck have I been anyway? But every country now is suffering problems with trees, and they all want help. I was just in Barcelona. It was 10 days ago, and I have 4 negative COVID tests, so don't worry too much. But Barcelona is, of course, the city of trees, because Gaudi, the architect, based everything on trees. And so the chief architect of Barcelona invited me over there because they want to build a Mayaca. They want, during their United Nations Year of Urban Tree status, they want to do some smashing, wonderful things. So they would like to be just like Mayaca State Park. So they're going to build a canopy walkway for Barcelona, just like our little Mayaca. So it just intrigues me how trees are becoming more important and more, you know, coveted, but obviously there's still a whole lot of people cutting them down. So in the last 6 chapters of the book, I did visit some different places in the world where trees are important and told some of the stories about studying them, falling, not falling, finding anacondas, doing all the stuff that happens when you're a field biologist. But the stories include the Amazon and in India and Malaysia. Hello. Ooh, has a mind of its own. Hello. Malaysia and the redwoods out in California, which I worked on with kids in wheelchairs. I won't tell you how that worked out because it was fabulous, and it reminds me that, you know, there's a lot of need to include minorities in science, and that's really one of my passions. So all of these different projects everywhere that I worked on ended up helping people understand the importance of the canopy and then helping them use the canopy. And it really got set up in a way because when I was in Australia climbing with my homemade harness, I had an Earthwatch project. Maybe some of you know this group that lets volunteers come on expeditions, and the owner of the Rainforest Lodge got a little nervous. He said, Meg, what if one of your Earthwatch volunteers that you've so, you know, carefully taught to climb actually falls? Will it be my fault? And so we sat down and drank a beautiful bottle of Australian wine, as everyone does in Australia when you have to solve a problem. And by the end of the bottle of wine, we'd drawn on the napkin this idea, like, what if we could make a trail in the treetops so people could walk through the treetops instead of climb? And lo and behold, we got some engineers, and the first canopy walkway was built in 1985 in Queensland, Australia. Anybody been to it? Lamington National Park? Just for, oh, there's a field trip. And so that brought me back eventually to the States, where I built the first public canopy walkway in North America in Myakka. So this is the first, and fabulous. Technically, when you do the math, according to our, you know, Sarasota County tourism formula, it brings in about $30 million a year revenue to the county. It has 500,000 visitors a year. So that in itself suddenly gave me this idea, you know what, canopies aren't just for discovery of new species and just for scientists to visit, but there's a lot of education and there's a lot of potential economics that's possible from that. And so the last chapter of the book is a little bit sort of my swan song. I hope before I end up in the grave with all the earthworms, which I really am excited about meeting, that I can finish this last project that I'm working on now through the Tree Foundation. Anybody heard of Sylvia Earle? She's an oceanographer. Anyway, she's a really good friend and became a mentor in my older years because I never knew too many women scientists. And Sylvia's a little older than I am, and she studies undersea, but we both have the same kind of wonderful stories about our lives around the world. And so she started a project called Mission Blue to highlight important biodiversity spots undersea, which are coral reefs and fishery zones and things like that. And so she's been doing that for about 10 years and arrived at about 100 of these hope spots, as she calls them. So I decided I would parallel Sylvia with her blessing, and we just started last year a project called Mission Green. And that's because, as I mentioned before, half of the world's trees are gone now, and in some countries less than 5% of their trees remain. Madagascar, Ethiopia, to name a few, 20% in India. Believe it or not, in the US, 97% of our primary forests were cut down. What we see a lot in North America is regrowth, because we live in the temperate zones where trees grow quite quickly, and we're blessed with that. But that will not be possible in the Amazon, because once those are clear cut, it's probably thousands of years to recover, to bring back all of those orchids and their pollinators, to bring back all of those butterflies and the flowers that they feed on, to bring back all of those animals that will disappear with the clear cutting is almost next to impossible. So we really can't ever expect to have people as lucky as Americans were, because we were able to regrow a lot of our forests. We still probably don't know what we're missing, because most of that happened at the turn of the last century, and nobody was counting what lived in the canopy at that point in time. But Mission Green Green identifies the 10 most endangered forests of the world that have the highest diversity. In other words, it's kind of like saying, let's pick the 10 art galleries of the world that you want to save, but all the rest are going to burn. And that's, sometimes what people do with art. We put the best art in art galleries, and it's the only ones we ever see, but maybe a lot of them are unfortunately getting lost to culture and wars and different kinds of strife within countries. But right now we have a problem where we're cutting down, burning, clearing half of the species of the world, and yet we don't have any place to save them like a genetic library. So with walkway construction, we can give the local people employment. We can train them as guides, bird guides, and ecotourist lodge operators. And we can't just tell people in the Amazon, please save your forests, because we want them up here in New York and Florida. We have to give them employment. We have to figure out a way that they have a dignified life. So by bringing ecotourism to these different endangered places, we can definitely give them employment. We can educate visitors who go there, and we can build these walkways so that they can in turn become sustainable in conserving their forests. So each walkway is about $1 million in cost, and so we're halfway funded for a walkway in Madagascar in April. We're going over there because that country has less than 3% of its forests left, and we can't waste any time. We can't just say, let's put all those species in put them in the refrigerator for a couple years and we'll come back when we're ready. We have to do these forests now. So that's what Mission Green is about, and that's what the end of the book is about. And hopefully, if you read this book, you'll get a little flavor of the craziness of being a woman in science, the joy of discovering new species, the excitement and the drama of conservation. I met with a foundation recently in New York City, and the guy leaned over to me and said, can I ask you a personal question? He said, given your work on saving rainforests, what antidepressant do you take every day? I told him I just sniffed the flowers. But anyway, that's kind of where the book is going, and I'm really happy to give a copy to your library here, and I'm happy to sign books afterward, and I'm also happy to answer a couple questions, and then maybe we'll retreat indoors to sign the books. But please, anytime, one last little word of hope. We need to save big trees, and unfortunately, it's not good enough just to plant new trees. To cut down a big tree and plant 10 little trees is like saying, I'm sorry, but any of you here who are over 40, we're going to take you off the earth right now, but we're going to replace you with 5 little babies. It's like taking our senior gifted and talented and doing away with them. And the senior trees, the big trees, store the most carbon, house the most species, produce the most shade, produce the most oxygen, are the most effective machines on the planet. And there is no excuse for burning them or cutting them. Usually a good architect can design around it. If it's a mall, maybe they can make a courtyard. If it's a road, maybe they can figure out some solutions for some slight repatterning. But just please, please don't let them cut down any more big trees in your neighborhood, because that's your gold. That's your children's gold, actually, maybe not yours, but that's the treasure that our kids can't get back in their lifetimes if we don't take good care of it. So thank you for listening.
Are there any questions for Meg? A couple questions.
Meg, have you seen the Venice area beautifications, new urban forest?
Yeah. To be honest, not well. I've heard a lot about it, and if you can believe this, I was working in Antarctica and then I was in Barcelona. So I plan to do that. And what should I look for? Good, bad, or ugly, or wonderful?
Wonderful.
Good. I mean, I've heard a lot about these. In the celery fields, there's a similar thing going on at Benderson Park.
Right.
I'm really excited about that. And every kid deserves to plant trees, and families, and it's a great investment for our grandchildren, so don't get me wrong. But just don't let it always be a substitute thing. I think we need to do both, okay? Great to hear that, because coming from you, I know it must be good.
Please repeat
Oh, yeah, he wondered about the Venice replanting project, if I'd been down there, so now it's on my list. Yes.
Where do you live now?
Oh, I live in Osprey. I just live up the road. So very close. In fact, to be honest, you know, after I was the director of Selby way back in the time when it was in the red and we had to do all sorts of things like remove toxic waste from the soil. The good old days when we had a lot of science then too, which was great. I was a professor at New College, which was lovely. And then I was recruited to North Carolina to open their science museum wing, and then recruited to San Francisco to add diversity to a 163-year museum that had only one female scientist out of 100 staff in the science department. So that kind of thing was a calling for me. So, but I kept a little place in Osprey. So when my dad got ill a couple years ago, I said, I think it's time to get back to Florida. So I'm really happy to be here. It's my home sweet home. Not far from coming down here and seeing my son get married and maybe stealing away for a weekend with Buff's beautiful lodge.
Great. Very good.
Thank you so much.
Here's one more.
One more question? Gee.
What do you think of Selby cutting down trees for a parking garage?
I think you know what I think. I purposefully avoided a lot of media questions on that because I want success for the gardens, but that obviously just I would have made a different choice for sure. And so I hope it works out well, but I guess the cement industry is happy.
The question was about Selby Gardens and
Cutting the trees.
new renovation going on there.